Ready? Okay. Well, Nora Bateson.
Good morning. Thank you, Peter, and thanks to all of you. And thank you for that beautiful opening and welcome to this land and the history that's here. I feel like I've come from a long way away. And it's a wonderful place to be a visitor with that sort of welcome. And last night we started talking about this moment and where we are in this moment. Where are we in this moment? And who is we and what is this moment? Not to be cheeky about that, but these are important questions. And it's important because our notion of self, notion of identity, has everything to do with how we perceive ourselves in our world. What kind of sense-making is taking place there? What sort of senses are we making? And what are the informations, the influences, the stories, the memories, the metaphors that have come together and are still coming together within us and between us and the world around us that provide this sense-making process. And this makes all the difference. It really makes all the difference in what decisions we make, what the way we choose to interact with each other and the natural world, and really, like quite literally, what makes sense. What is it that makes sense to do? In the film last night, were all of you here for the film last night? Was anybody not here? Okay, sorry. If I make reference, we'll have to catch up. There's a discussion in there by the governor of California, Jerry Brown, who addresses the topic of the double bind. And the double bind is a concept that my father and his colleagues at what's now the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto brought into the world. In that moment, it was brought into the world in regard to schizophrenia, okay? But I have to clear the record, let me just say that they were under a deadline for a grant. And my father went to his grave actually distraught at the misunderstanding of what the double bind and the significance of the double bind actually was. Because it got put into the world as a causation of schizophrenia. Okay, now causation, if you know anything about my dad's work, causation would never be what he was talking about in that kind of singular form. But besides that, it was meant to be a way of thinking about evolution. It was an evolutionary theory. It wasn't necessarily about psychotherapy. And the idea was basically this, that every organism, their survival is dependent upon their ability to make sense of their world. How is each organism able to make sense of its world and survive within it? If it can't make sense of its world, it can't survive. But, and here's the hitch, things change. In complex contextual relationships, all the organisms are changing. And so after a while, that sense-making that once was survival has to change. And at that moment, those organisms can be in a kind of double bind, much like the one that that certainly Western civilization is in now. And since Western civilization has spread around the globe, it's pretty much at full tilt double bind. And that is this. In order to survive in our world, we have to take part in processes that we know are eliminating possibilities of the future. We get in our cars, we go to work, we're taking part in systems and infrastructures of systems that are inherently exploitative of other people, of nature, of ourselves, of the future, and so on. But if you don't do that, you can't pay the rent or buy food for the children. So if you continue, you die. If you discontinue, you die. This is a double bind. So what is the creative imperative there? How do we begin to think about this in ways that allow us to make sense of our world in a new way so that we can be part of a mutual contextual survival process? Maybe even thrive, who knows? So the double bind, I think, is an important place to start. To recognize and just start with the fact that there is nothing in this room, there's probably nothing that I had for breakfast that has not come from the possibilities that were produced by exploitation. I mean, let's just be clear about this. And this cannot continue. It just cannot continue. So how do we get out of it? How do we begin to move our sense-making processes into different ways of not only perceiving but responding? So I started working on this process, this thinking, and what came to me was this. I grew up in a household where people talked about systems. But for me, a system was something that I was inside of, that I am, that was juicy and messy and gooey and unpredictable. And then I went out in the world and I heard people talking about systemics and systems theory and systems thinking. And somehow the system was over there. And when they started to describe it, the description looked a whole lot like a blueprint with arrows. And I felt uncomfortable with this. And for some people, these models were really useful. But for me, I found them desperately limiting. And I was at this conference on how to restructure global economy, you know, like you do. And we must have gone through 25 different models of various geometries with arrows and to depict systemic movement and so on and so forth with all the best intention, all the best thinking. And after about the 25th one, I was like, oh, no more models. Can we please stop with the models? There's more complexity in just the palm of my hand than you can draw at those models on the entire wall. So let's just stop now. And someone said, but why? And without thinking, I volunteered because it's learning. And I actually began to go from there into what became this work on symmathesy. So I want to share this with you. Not because it's a new sort of hack to crack the code of life, or a trend that you can adopt, or a new methodology, or a formula, because I don't actually hold much truck with any of that. But just because it's another way of looking, and you might find something that you hadn't seen before. And that's enough. Yeah. Let's start with complexity. So I just want to welcome complexity and be very, very clear where I am with this, which is that we live in a world that is constantly looking for something that it's called simplicity. But my feeling is that we don't actually mean simplicity, we mean reductionism. That it takes an awful lot of complexity to produce this beautiful, simple flower. It's just a simple flower. You have a simple craving for chocolate, but what is the complexity behind that? The metaphors, the enzymes, and the memories, and the endorphins, and what is actually inside that craving for chocolate? A simple craving for chocolate. All I know is I want a piece of chocolate. All I know is that's a simple flower. But the simplicity of that flower is possible only within its complexity. Pull it out of its complexity and you lose the vitality that makes this flower possible. Okay, so I want to be very clear that even though we live in a world that's aching to make everything simple and easy, that what we need to be careful with is reductionism. So the opposite of complexity is not simplicity. It's reductionicity. But that's not a word, so we'll call it reductionism. And I think this is something to watch out for, because this is not about making a 5-step program or about a, formula. This is not a hack for life. This is about recognizing and exploring with curiosity, with wonder and appreciation, the many interrelationships and interdependencies that give life vitality. There's sort of at least 3 different realms of complexity that are overlapping in our sense-making process. And one of them is our conceptual process. And that, of course, is very complex. It includes language and culture and ancestral memory. It includes education and science. It includes what we do with our bodies and the habituated way we move. Do we play violin? Are you a jogger? Do you sing? What are the ways in which you are making sense of your world? And that whole conceptual process is very complex. Fair enough? But it's taking place within an ecology of the biosphere, which is also complex. And your body is part of that. Your microbiome is part of the larger ecology. Some small fraction of you is actually you. Whatever it is, they keep changing the numbers, but at last count, I think it was about 5 or 10% of your body is actually you, and the rest is other organisms and water. So who are you? And how do we fit into our ecological world? What is that fitting and that interaction process? So that's complex. And then, in case that wasn't enough, there's culture. And the larger sort of societal, cultural beliefs that we are moving in and out of in response to. And so these sort of 3 versions of complex realms are interweaving, intermingling, stewing together, and we are within it. I'd like to make a point here about the words. Okay, we're playing with words today. And language is important. And in our world, we've come to a moment where we can talk pretty freely. We can speak freely about interconnectedness. But interconnectedness might not be enough. When we think of interconnectedness, it's easy to have this kind of idea that there are things that are connected. whether they're dots or, this one's kind of 3D, so it gets a little bit deeper. But there's a big difference between the idea of interconnected and interdependent. And what you might do, what is your doing in an interconnected situation, and what is your doing in an interdependent process? How might you think about what it is that you need to do? Make sense of yourself in the interdependency versus in this kind of a realm where you might be able to harbor the illusion that you could move little pieces and somehow get away with that. So this is, I think, a fairly significant shift to be careful with in our language. And that this kind of interdependency that we're talking about requires a depth and a sensitivity. It requires careful attention. Because deep down, where's Will? Will's got his jam jar shirt on. So, nice shirt. Deep down in our culture, there is a metaphor of a machine. And it's so deep. It comes in and it sneaks into so much of what we do. And it sneaks in when you don't even know you're doing it. And the next thing you know, you're talking about your own child or your own body as though it were functioning like a machine. We think often about our lives in reference to Will's jam jar shirt. There's a piece in my symmathesy paper about sort of the perception of self as a kind of jam jar that goes through life and gets filled up in education and gets a label put on it and kind of gets boxed and put out in the world, and you go one thing to the next, and you kind of move through your life in this jam jar factory. But I'm not a jam jar, and you're not a jam jar. And somehow this deep mechanistic dream is informing us in our sense-making, our recognition of who we are in the world around us at important and profound levels. So, in this case, you might be a part of a system, and you could identify the edges of the part that you are. But in this case, it's much more difficult to find the edges and to recognize, where is the forest? Is the forest in the moss? Is the forest in the trees? Is the forest in the water? Is the forest in the insects? Is it in the dying leaves or the growing leaves? Where's the forest? And of course, the forest is only possible in the interdependency between those. And they're all changing all the time. Good morning. How you doing? So far, so good? Okay. So, who am I? I started to play with this word transcontextual. And it's a word that I got out of Steps to an Ecology of Mind. It's a word that I think has found its way into quite a bit of theory these days. And it hardly ever gets called back to Gregory. So just for the record, this is a Gregory word. And it came up in terms of the double bind. Okay, so what's happening in a double bind is that you have multiple contexts that are experiencing contradictions. So, an easy version of a double bind might look like this. Have you ever been in a relationship where you were either the partner that said to the other one, "You never tell me you love me," or you're that other person? I don't know, I've kind of been on both sides of that one. Neither side is good. And when your partner says to you, "You never tell me that you love me," it's Valentine's Day, so it's appropriate. And you wonder what to say. What if I say, "But yes, I do," then that's not very sincere. You're only saying that because you have to. But if you don't say it, then they're right. right? And so you're kind of stuck in this moment, and you can't really say, yeah, but you got me stuck there. So that's a double bind, where you get caught against two different contextual processes. And what's happening is that we get a trans-contextual experience. Peter said last night, some of my best friends are academics. And I have felt very limited by the idea of transdisciplinarity, of recognizing that the world is not taking place really in disciplines. The world takes place in contexts. And so I felt that for my own work, what I started to discover was that this noticing of contextual interaction across multiple contexts was enormously useful. And it really made a difference in getting from here to here. Right? This one you can draw out in 2 dimensions. This one you can't. Okay? So what does that mean? So basically no living system is taking place in just one context. Let me start with the self. So who am I? Well, I'm a daughter. I'm some 100 trillion organisms. I'm a mother. I'm a filmmaker. I am my tax ID number. I am my poetry. I am myself as a 7-year-old. I am myself as the 85-year-old I am not yet. I'm a sister. I'm a friend. I'm a lover. And in each one of those contextual processes, there's a different kind of relational communication, a completely different set of patterns and interactions that are taking place. The me that is talking to you right now is very different than the me that's in interaction with my smoothie right now. Right? These are different kinds of contextual communicational processes. And that's important. I'm still me. I'm still me. Those transcontextual processes are perpetually coming together, always responding and adjusting. But I'm still me. And when I talk to you, I'm still a mom, even though I might adopt a sort of quasi-professional tonality. I'm still a daughter. I'm still my DNA, my ancestry. And so I like to think of this notion of self then as an ecology. And an ecology that doesn't actually end at the edge of my skin. This notion of identity where the I ends here. Where is the edge of me? I mean, this skin might keep the juicy stuff inside. But also, it's transmission, right? I'm receiving a lot of information. I'm giving a lot of information. You can see me blush. You can see me, right? There's all kinds of things that are happening through this interface. Are my ideas the edge of me? Is my language the edge of me? Is my microbiome and its interaction with the ecology around me, is that the edge of me? So when I want to think about my health, where is my health? Is it in my body? If my family's not healthy, am I healthy? Can my family be healthy in a community that's not healthy? Is my community healthy in a biosphere that's not healthy? Where is the edge of my health? Where am I in this? So this notion of transcontextual description I have found to be so useful, and I invite you to use it whenever you want to if it serves you. Again, recognizing that partially what we're talking about is sense making, and that has a lot to do with our notions of self. I'm a little bit careful in this moment about using the term identity because it has such a lot of baggage in our culture right now. And some of it's very necessary, but I don't want to get into it. Okay, moving on. So I started to feel like we needed a new word. I went looking for a way to talk about myself or systems or living processes in ways that allowed them to learn. And what I found was I couldn't find one. So I decided that I would make one up. Okay? And so I made up this word. And the word is symmathesy. The sim comes from the Greek together, and the mathesy comes from the Greek for learning. And basically, symmathesy is to learn together. And it's the idea that any organism is responding to the world around it and is learning and changing and finding ways to be in mutual responsiveness, in mutual learning with its contexts. Is that clear? So if you're walking through the woods and you see a tree, and that tree is standing straight and tall, and you see another part of the woods, the same kind of tree, but this tree is crooked and bent and gnarly. And you might come at this with an idea that you need to straighten that tree. And you think, how are we going to straighten that tree? And one possibility is to look at that tree and think, well, we need to clip this or tie this or trim that. But another possibility would be to ask, how is this tree learning to be in its world? How is the tree learning to be in its world? How is it that the crookedness, the form that we see, is a reflection of the information that the tree is within, in relation to the bacteria in the soil, in relation to the casting of the shadows, in the relation to the other creatures, in the relation to the sun, the water, the wind? Is that tree in a state of mutual learning with all those other organisms? So the earthworms are in there, and the deer, and the human beings, and the flows of water. And when we see that crooked tree, we might do much better to ask ourselves, how is that tree learning to be in its world? Now, I want to be clear about a couple of things. One is that we are often accustomed to thinking about learning as being an accumulation of knowledge in a kind of progression. And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about learning as a responsiveness to other responses, and learning to respond in new ways as a means of sense making. So learning need not be positive. You can learn to be violent, you can learn to lie, you can learn to be addicted. Okay? And that's important to recognize, that when we're talking about things that are pathological, what we're talking about is ways in which the organisms, people, societies have learned to be in the context of their world. And if learning is the pathology, so is healing learning as well. So moving into other kinds of learning. So symmathesy. Symmathesy. How are these organisms learning to be in their world? So as a noun, symmathesy is basically an entity formed by contextual mutual learning through interaction. If you are wanting this information in written form, you can find several different journals have published papers on it, and there's a chapter in my book on it, so you can find it if you go looking for it. You don't have to write everything down today. But the world isn't made of nouns, is it? And so we need a verb too. And the verb is to symmathesize, and that is to generate mutual learning contexts through the process of interaction between multiple variables in a living entity. All right, the thing is, when you make definitions, they get really crunchy. So I'm a symmathesy, you're a symmathesy, a forest is a symmathesy, a society is a symmathesy. Any living system can actually be described as a symmathesy. To symmathesize, an example would be that we are currently experiencing the difficulties of symmathesizing Facebook into our culture. Or in the US is symmathesizing the way in which Trump communicates. Okay, the way in which Trump communicates is there is a learning, a contextual learning that's taking place around these new forms of communication that have been normalized at the highest level of government, where suddenly there's meanness and rudeness where there was a code of a certain kind of courtesy, which was also toxic, by the way. But how are we symmathesizing these new modalities of communication? So do you understand what I'm saying? Is this working for you? There's a learning that's happening, a mutual learning in the culture, where you can't quite point to where it is or how it is, but it is. So how is the tree symmathesizing into its context? How is the environment symmathesizing with the tree? Right? It's mutual. The earthworms are going to move in different ways around those roots, in different temperatures that are taking place, different pools of water, different moistures, different pockets of bacteria. The leaves will fall in different places because of the wind, and the other organisms will grow and move around those organisms. There's a symmathesy going on. All right, the same thing is true in a family. So if you have a mother and a father and children, and the mother comes home and she's completely devastated and stressed out and going through all kinds of emotional upheaval and crisis, the children will respond in different ways to each other, to their mother, to their father, who's responding in different ways to the mother. They're symmathesizing a trauma. They're responding to the responses. Okay, some of those responses might look like a quieting down or a deferring or a respecting. Some of those responses might actually look like aggression or resentment. Some of them might look like care and, "Mommy, can I make you a cup of tea?" Maybe when you're the mom, not as much of that as you might hope for. But, it could happen. All right. Yeah, so here's a tree making sense of its world. And some days, I think, I feel a little like that tree. I'm sure you know people who are living life in ways a little like that tree, where they're learning to be in their world in ways in which they have had to make incredible contortions to figure it out. My dad is credited with the sentence, "The evolution is in the context," but to be perfectly honest, that comes from his father. And there's a long story that I would tell you about this, but we don't have time to really go into it, only to say that there is a necessary recognition that there's a shift in paying attention to how evolution takes place. And the habit has been to notice evolution taking place in the organism over time. The chromosome theory really depended upon that sort of information. And in a way, it's true. But the thing is that also the organisms are responding to their context. They are changing in response to the contextual relationships they need to survive within. So there's another form of studying evolution that is becoming more popular now through epigenetics and so on and so forth, that's beginning to recognize that change takes place in context, not just in a singular organism. So the evolution is in the context. Here we are. These two trees are actually the same kind of tree, about 10 meters apart from each other, responding in different ways to their world. Okay, so here we are. This is the problem. Who are we? So this is a snow fox in a tundra. Can you see him? And this is a stick bug in a tree. And this is a leaf frog on a leaf. And this is a leaf gecko. Okay? Now I want to ask you, where is the edge of the fox? Where is the edge of the frog? Where is the edge of the stick bug or the gecko? Where is the edge of you? When we talk about systems change, when we talk about learning to be in our context, the way in which we are of our context is so significant and profound. It's really easy to overlook how deep in we are. Who is a stick bug with no tree? Who is the snow fox with no snow? Right, all the way down into the physiological, the biological way of being, of metabolizing, of sense-making, of moving, of camouflaging, of protecting, of thriving. All the way in is this notion of context. It's very inconvenient. If we were only more like machines, we could go in, change a couple of components, replace the parts, and carry on. But that's not how it is. They've symmathesized. They're learning to be in their world. And the contexts that they're within, that we are within, are part of the continuum that they are, that we are. Very difficult to find the separations. So this is sort of the next step, right? First we kind of figured out that there was a need to recognize interconnectedness. Then we kind of figured out, oh yeah, well, kind of interdependent. Then we get into this level and it's like, uh-oh, this is deep. So perceiving and describing context is something that requires practice, but it's not impossible. It's kind of a muscle, right? Monet did it. If you look up close at a Monet, you can see these like goopy, blotchy things that don't really make much sense, and then suddenly you step back and there's light and life in ways that former artistic techniques didn't have this kind of life that Impressionism brought. But Monet didn't have paintbrushes that were 10 meters long. Somehow he was able to perceive in those details the context that he was illustrating. And how might we begin to practice that type of perception and description, where the details are coming into synchronicity and into sense-making with the larger context of what we're doing. So context and contexts are some of the criteria of symmathesy. I'm kind of going through the criteria now. And of course, that brings us to transcontextuality, which is, If we thought context was hard, now we're going to add more. However, I do want to say that adding more context, as far as I can figure out, actually makes it easier. And the reason is that it's real. It's just what's there, right? So this is a bowl of soup. I was in Seoul, Korea one night, and I was really sick, and I had a bowl of soup. And that's one context of what that bowl of soup is. But this bowl of soup is also about agriculture, right? It's also an economy. It's also culture. It's also intergenerational recipe exchange. It's also ecology. It's medicine. It's what else is it? It's probably somewhat political. Yeah. It's spicy. There's my kimchi, and that's my probiotics right there. So the transcontextuality, I find, makes things much easier. Trying to explain or describe the beautiful complexity of life in ways that make it flat is challenging and difficult, and it hurts. Once we make space for it to actually be alive and to shift and to learn and to be in responsiveness, frankly, it hurts your head for a second to think about. But as soon as you get used to it, it's much easier. Another aspect of symmathesy is actually bias. And I've chosen the word bias with difficulty, right? Bias is often considered something negative. But basically what I'm getting at is that all of the participants, all of the processes taking place in a symmathesy have particular ways of making sense, right? The earthworms are earthworming, and the tree is treeing, and the bacteria is bacteriaing. And that's what they need to do, right? The sense-making that's happening with the earthworm in that part of the forest is not the same as the sense-making that's taking place with the roots of the trees or the bacteria or the birds in the trees or the human beings that are in relationship. Completely different kinds of sense-making taking place. And somehow those responsivenesses are in relation to each other, forming differences, making connections, shifting, calibrating. This is my apartment. And if you look out the front window of my apartment, you see a very different world than you do if you look out the back window. It's not the same. There's a different perspective, a different epistemology, a different Umwelt, if you're familiar with that term. And this, do you recognize this box? Anybody recognize this box? This is the box from the Little Prince. And the man in the Little Prince, the Little Prince says, "Can you draw me a sheep?" Do you remember this part? And the man draws him a sheep, and he says, "Wow, that's a terrible sheep. That looks nothing like my sheep." So the man draws him another sheep, and he says, "Terrible, terrible, terrible. Bad sheep." And then finally the man, he gets frustrated, and he draws this box, and he draws these holes, and he says, "Your sheep's in the box." And at that point, the Little Prince says, "How did you know exactly what my sheep looked like?" Because for each one of us, there's a different sheep in that box. And that's as it should be. That's perfectly beautiful and rich and lovely forms of possibilities of interaction and connection. Another aspect of symmathesy is the notion of stochastic process. That somewhere in life there is a combination of chaos and order. And that in the middle of chaos and order, in that liminal space between chaos and order, there is mutual learning. That's where the symmathesy is. So those are my kids. And as you can see, they're not puppies or piglets. They are actually, there is order, right? They actually come from me, and you can see that resemblance. On the other hand, they're not me. and they're not each other. There is chaos. There is some kind of random differentiation in there somehow, and if I had another one, God forbid, it would have not very many characteristics that were similar to the first two, but they would have some. So there is order. It is always changing, but it's changing within order. However, the change is also chaos. And it's right there in that responsiveness and responsiveness to responsiveness that you start to get that mutual learning, the symmathesy is taking place. Boundaries. How am I for time? Am I out of time, Peter?
Pretty much.
Well, I'm not done yet. I'll be fast. Okay. So boundaries are really important, and we have to talk about boundaries. And how do we recognize boundaries in living processes in ways in which allow us to understand, as my dad was saying last night, that the boundaries that we draw are arbitrary, but they can still be useful, right? Wise men see outlines and therefore they draw them, but fools see outlines and therefore they draw them, right? It's both madness and wisdom to draw outlines. We need those outlines to study, but we have to put things back. So what are the boundaries? So in symmathesy, I talk about boundaries in terms of interfaces of mutual learning. So I got really stuck thinking about parts and wholes. And I hate parts and wholes because every time you start to talk about parts and wholes, the next thing you know, what you're talking about is some kind of engineering diagram again. You start to get into arrangements. In fact, the word system comes from the word arrangement. So being careful not to get down into that sticky, messy, mechanistic metaphor that's lurking everywhere. And recognizing that we still have to talk about how things are coming together. You know, the earthworm is not the tree. And yet the earthworm and the tree together with the soil and the microbacteria are another system. So the parts are the wholes and the wholes are the parts. And pretty soon you get really confused. And you wonder, how the hell should we talk about this? And I actually tried in this paper to get away from parts and wholes and just to call all of that stuff vitae or vitae, just life. Let me tell you, that didn't work. I tried, but it didn't work. The main thing is to recognize that boundaries are interfaces of learning, and that opens up a lot of useful material. So interestingly enough, there are schools of family therapy in Asia and in the Middle East, particularly in Islamic family therapy, where they've recognized symmathesy as a way to talk and work with families. Didn't see that coming. And it's about this notion of boundaries and interfaces, of looking at if you have a child who's having a rough time, that instead of identifying the child, like my sister's talking about, we talk about what are the interfaces of mutual learning the child is within, and allowing the other family members to begin to participate in that perception of how is the child learning to be in its world. You know, and there's a boundary of an interface that is with the kids, or with the parents, or with the grandparents, or the schools, or whatever. And how is that child learning to be in its world? Right. So the hitch is time, is that whenever you're looking at a complex living system, it's taking place in time. And in time, relationships shift. They move, they respond, they calibrate, and they keep responding, they keep learning. And so when you add time to any kind of communication, it turns into learning. Maybe that learning is considered positive or negative, or maybe we have no business judging that. But nevertheless, when you add time, the thing doesn't stay the same. That's the main thing. And in that, it is continuing to symmathesize, it's continuing to learn, to grow, and to shift in its contexts. And what's happening is play. We talked a tiny bit about this play business last night. It's the process of when you and I are talking to each other, what are we doing? Whatever you say, I'm kind of finding how that fits in me and what I would respond to and how I read you and what script who I see in you, and then I would respond from there. But if I were talking to you, Nicola, I might have a very different response to a very similar script. We would have, even if we were using the same words, the tones or the body language would be different. That there's a constant process of finding the limits and the boundaries, the edges of where our relationship is. So it might look like I'm standing up here blah, blah, blahing to you this morning. Sorry about that. But actually, you are very much communicating with me. And if I don't respond to the communication that I perceive, I'm going to make mistakes that will really disrupt our relational process. If I can't perceive them, I will disrupt them. So this business of play is really important. It has to do with how we enter into these processes. And all of life is doing this. All of life, even with its ingrained patterns, is also exploring and improvising, finding new ways to respond to context all the time. Right. Okay, so here's the paradox, and then I'll stop. There's a paradox. And it's a beautiful, useful, productive paradox. And it has to do with, I call it the paradox of agency. This is not a new idea. There's lots of this in Taoism and so on and so forth. But the idea is that I am totally unique, right? My epistemology, my frame, my filters, the way I make sense of the world is totally unique to me. My experiences, the way I taste blueberries and the sense I make of blueberries is very different than yours. The way that I feel the Australian morning and make sense of it is very different than the way that you do. Because my experience is referring to Sweden, is referring to the weather in London I just came from, and the smells, and right? So I have a whole different process. And in that sense, I'm very much me. There is nobody who can perceive it the way that I perceive it. I'm totally unique. But when I ask myself, what in me is mine? And I start to realize everything that has come together to form those sense-making processes has come from my contexts. Everything, from my DNA to my digestive system that's connected to the ecology, to my language, to what I learned in school, to the privilege that I carry with my culture, to the whatever it is. It's coming from my contexts. So, I am me, but I'm not me. And this is really useful because in the sort of age-old battle of free will versus determinism, we get down one path or the other. And you can say, it's my responsibility, it's my fault, I am going to do this thing in the world. I am going to be the implementer of this thing, I, me, this, do, that, act. Right? And not notice that you're a fox in the tundra or a stick bug in the tree. That you can't get out of it. But if you're like, hey man, the society made me do it. It's not my fault. It's not my responsibility. I'm staying home and watching Netflix. Forget about it. That's another dysfunctional approach to recognizing that you are absolutely of it and in it. And in that sense, there is this tension between the agency you have and the agency you don't have. Now, this tension is so productive. It provides a pull and to perceive both the zoom in and the zoom out of where you are in your world, who you are in your world, how you are in your world, where you are, when you are. But it doesn't answer it for you. It doesn't give you a 5-step, easy peasy, all you have to do is recycle, switch to alternative energy, buy green. It's going to take more than that. It's at the level of what do we want? How do we see ourselves? What do we crave? What is that? So the tension is great. Just don't solve it. Keep the paradox, welcome the paradox, explore the paradox, screw up in the paradox, but recognize that it's there. And with that, I'm going to just say thank you so much, and we will continue because I didn't even get to talk about warm data yet. So. Thank you, Julia.